Beer's popular. Okay, cool. It's good to know. Okay, so I've got a bit of a story to start off with. I joined Atlassian 9 years ago. And when I joined Atlassian, I was working on the Fisheye Crucible team. We were in the middle of a 28-week release. So we were working on something for 28 weeks. I was in the middle of it. We kept going for another 14 weeks. It was like, in these days, 28 weeks is like, oh my God, really? If you're taking 28 weeks to release anything, how will anyone ever see it and ever know what you're doing? A bit after that, we decided 28 weeks was too slow, so we accelerated to 13-week releases. And I think we had 5 2-week sprints and then 3 1-week sprints. And then the 1-week sprints, we're like fixing bugs and stuff like that. And so I think at the time, we were one of the fastest teams in Atlassian. So this is still 9 years ago. It was quite a while ago, right? A little bit later on, I joined the Bitbucket server team. And again, the Bitbucket server team was the fastest team in Atlassian at the time. This was like pre-cloud, right? So this is mostly server days. Bitbucket server team was putting out a new release every 5 weeks. So this is a 2.1, a 2.2. There were bug fixes going out whenever we needed to put them out. But every 5 weeks, we'd have a release go out. And as I said, fastest moving team in Atlassian at the time. We'd have 2 2-week sprints and then 1 week of 20% or innovation week. So fast forward to 2019, I'm in the Bitbucket Cloud Pipelines team. Last week, we released 33 times, right? So this is clearly a very, very different world. We still actually do 2 2-week sprints followed by a week of 20% or innovation, but the whole way that we're thinking and doing things and building software and releasing software is completely different. So we're trying to get to this space and going. That was a big shift, right? There's been shifts in the software industry that mean that we're moving in this direction. But there's something that we still need to make sure that we're doing, and that is we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing, right? So moving fast is just an indicator of, it's a symptom of something that's going on in our industry. It's not the end in itself. The end in itself is to add value to you, our users, more quickly. And there's a whole bunch of reasons and there's a whole bunch of things that have changed in our industry that are pushing us in that direction. So there's a lot more competition out there. So we've got a lot of competitors. We need to keep moving fast. I think something we learned back in the Bitbucket server days when we were putting out an early version of a product that didn't have so many features, but we need to convince people that we were moving fast and we were getting them out there. This has almost now become the norm for our users in that if you have a product that doesn't keep innovating and adding new features and stuff like that, it'll stagnate and your users will move to some other product that's working better. So you need to keep putting those features out there and convincing your users that you will eventually have that key feature that they're looking for, or just that you're innovating and coming up with new things and that this is the place to be. My screens are flashing at me. Oh, that's all right. The other thing is, like, our users expect heaps better user experience, right? They want to have our competitors also have really good user experience. This is another thing we're competing on, is how good does our product feel to use and experience it. We also need to make sure that we're looking for value. So something else that's really changed here is how we iterate and understand whether a feature is worth doing. So previously, when we were doing a 28-week release, there was part of the time at the start of that release cycle was spent trying to figure out what we were doing, whether it was actually valuable, what the user problem was, how we were going to solve it. But now we need to much more be putting stuff out in front of our customers and iterating and getting their feedback about whether they find it useful. This is the best way to develop software that actually is useful. We don't want to put software out that no one uses. We want to put software out that people use. And also quality. Like our users don't want bugs. They just want a smooth user interface, a user experience that's really good for them and that works really well. Now, some of these are actually competing tensions, right? So figuring out whether this thing is the right thing to do and doing a really good design for it and having really good quality is the opposite of releasing things fast. Like, how do you actually resolve those tensions? And that's something I'll try and address. In that time when we've gone from 28 weeks to 33 releases every week, we have developed a number of different practices that we do inside of Atlassian, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of the ones that we do in my team. We do try and move fast. That's a big part of what we need to do, but I think the key is that we try to build the right thing, right? How are we going to be effective in what we're doing, not just efficient? There's no point in just putting out loads of stuff that nobody uses, right? I think everybody can appreciate that. So, I mean, and part of that is you're probably familiar with the project management tripod. This is the tension between time, resources, and scope, right? So if we take away people, then it's going to take more time, or we're going to have to cut what we're doing. If we want to add more things that we're doing, it's going to take more time or more people, etc. So this is just sort of a manifestation of that tension that you see between putting out something that's really good quality and is the right thing versus getting stuff out fast. So if we don't spend the right amount of time in researching what the problem is, I mean, that's really the key, is to understanding what our customer's problem is and spending the right amount of time trying to come up with a solution that satisfies that problem and then validating that solution with real users, hopefully through real software, then we're not going to ship the right thing. But again, there's a real problem in there. How do we fit that in when we're trying to release 33 times a week? So admittedly, our 33 times a week they're not all equal, right? One release, 33 times a week is not the same as a 28-week release. But they're still going out really frequently, and we need to do that in order to get that validation, the feedback that's happening. So if we looked at a classic waterfall release cycle, there's other problems that go on in there that manifest itself in smaller fashion across when you're trying to ship 33 times a week. So here we have a product manager. They're typically really busy when they're trying to figure out what we're doing and what the solution is. And once we get into development, the amount of effort they put in slacks off. But then they have to pick it up again at the end to deal with support people, operations people, marketing people, tech writers, and they're trying to be that person that's keeping everything going and make sure we have a good release as well. Whereas we've got our coders. Our coders are like the opposite, right? They don't have too much to do at the start, but then they get more engaged in the middle, and then they slack off at the end. And there's not so much for them to do. Whereas our marketers and our tech writers, they're more at the end of the cycle. So we've got a lot of peaks and troughs in here that aren't the sign of people who are actually going to be efficient. And we're never going to get effective work out if we've got people being idle and not being efficient as well. So what we really want to have is we want to get rid of those peaks and troughs. We don't want people burning out. We don't want people sitting around. And so we want them to have like a line that looks more like this. We want people to be working as optimally as they can. So there's a number of problems that we're facing across that sort of spectrum of competing tensions is what I would like to call it. So I mean, one of the things there, I just called out dependencies. There are people who are blocked on each other. If there's no designs, how does your engineering team move forward with the UI? The marketing team really needs stuff from product management in order to figure out how to market something. There's a whole bunch of people who are pushing and pulling on each other. Way back in that 28-week release cycle, we were date-driven. Like we were saying, we must hit this date, and we have all these marketing plans, and they'll have to line up on that. And so that causes real tensions as well. That's squashing everything down using the project management tripod. It's pushing everything down, so we're not perhaps figuring out what the problem is, solving the problem in the best way possible. So that's also a problem for us. The product managers are really overstressed, right? They have a lot to do, they have a lot to figure out, they become the central pivot for everything, and we just don't have enough of them. We can't have a one-to-one ratio of product managers to engineers. It's just not feasible. Well, maybe we could. We'd have to train up a few product managers, I think. And we're lacking validation. We're not putting stuff in front of people and saying, is this what you really want? Right, so we need to actually solve all of these problems for us to be able to move fast, to be shipping 33 times a week, which is actually not the goal, right? The goal is to be shipping effective code that our customers want. 33 times a week, as I said, that's a symptom of us doing the iteration and making sure that we're getting validation from our customers. As well as, sometimes the validation isn't from our customers, or sometimes it's a negative validation, like no customers complain because the service was down. So sometimes we're releasing small pieces of software frequently to make sure that we're not breaking things as well. So there's three main things that we're trying to look for when we figure out how to solve all these problems. Now, we didn't sit down and say we have to all solve all these problems, right? This was a very iterative approach over 9 years of the software development cycle changing and us developing this new process. As I showed you at the start, we didn't go straight from 28 weeks to 33 times a week. It took a long time to get there. Moving into the cloud is a big part of that. You can't release on-premise software 33 times a week. That's sort of crazy. You'd have a million different versions. But in the cloud, that's definitely the approach that we're taking. So we need to make sure that we're building the right thing. We need to validate that we're building the right thing. That's just the key thing in order to be having a successful product, I think. We need to move fast in order to do that validation, right? And we need to part of moving fast is also making sure that your developers aren't spending heaps of time pushing buttons and making software get out there and having a manual quality testing team who's the gatekeeper for everything. And that doesn't help you get stuff out in front of customers and validate that it's the right thing either. And we need to make sure that people are effective, that we don't have people sitting around being idle. And that can be a problem when you've got big things and people having dependencies on each other. So we've sort of moved away from having date-driven development, and we try not to have date-driven development at all. Now, you could say, well, if you don't have any dates, then engineers will just spend forever on something, and I do know some engineers who totally would do that. Probably myself back in the day when I was an engineer. I'm engineering manager. But what we use instead is we use metrics, and we use metrics as our driver instead of date. So we try to have a metrics-driven approach where we say, we're going to set some sort of goal, and you aim towards that goal. I work on Bitbucket pipelines. It is a CI/CD system. I think CI/CD is crucially important. So we really need to empower the team to ship things quickly. And we need to figure out how we can make the team adaptive enough so that it can respond to the fact that there are different dependencies between people. People are going to get blocked at different times. And how are we going to deal with that? And how are we going to deal with the fact that there's not enough product manager to go around? There's a whole bunch of dependencies in between people, and how are we going to solve all those problems, basically? So I'm going to give you a quick overview of pipelines, not because there's an advertising segment, which it sort of is, but mostly because I'll give you a few examples of some stuff that we did in pipelines and how we've adapted to these things. So this is Bitbucket Pipelines. It exists inside Bitbucket, which is our cloud-based source code hosting system. It lets you build your code in multiple steps. In the cloud, you just push your code, it builds it. It's very simple and easy to use. You don't have to configure users or servers or anything like that. It has a built-in deployment feature where you can see what code you've deployed to which environment, when it went out, what difference there is between your environments, et cetera, what would happen if I promote this into production. And it integrates with all sorts of things. So it integrates really closely with Jira, so you can see your Jiras that you were about to release. In Jira, you can see what environment your code is in. And we also integrate with a whole bunch of partners as well through our recent pipes feature. Okay, so coming back to the three big pillars. I said we need to build the right thing, we need to ship fast, and we need to keep the team effective. So for me, building the right thing is about, like, let's get rid of that date-driven mentality and not have that at all. If we keep insisting on a date-driven mentality, we're going to compress down the time for validating and making sure that we're building the right thing. We need to have a metrics-driven approach instead. So we want to be driven by this feedback and metrics. We want it to drive the team as well and say, ideally the team's behavior and what they're thinking about and the problems they're trying to solve are all driven by some sort of metric that we're trying to shift here, right? It does mean you need to measure things. You need to, we try to measure practically everything in pipelines. We have a UI, but a lot of our interactions that our users have with our product is actually just through pushing code into Bitbucket. You push the code into Bitbucket, it runs a build. The build may have multiple phases. Sometimes you trigger a manual build, sometimes you trigger a scheduled build, which is non-interaction as well. But we're tracking clicks in the UI. We're tracking the features that people are using in their builds, like whether they're doing manual steps, parallel steps, whether they're using SSH keys to deploy things, what sort of pipes they're using. And we capture all of that data. If we don't have any of that data, then when we try and set ourselves a goal to change something or shift something, the first thing we're going to have to do is go off and start measuring that thing and produce a baseline, which is occasionally what we've had to do. So the whole concept of this using metrics to drive a development is something that we call outcome-driven development. Has anyone actually heard of the term outcome-driven development? Okay, a few people. It's basically saying, look, we shouldn't be driven by what we are trying to do. We should be driven by what we are trying to achieve, which is our outcome. What outcome are we trying to have? And ideally, in an outcome-driven development model, you will have an outcome that expresses some business value to your company. And I mean, your key business value is going to be how much money make. Are we viable this month? But we try and break those down into different metrics. So MAU is often something that we use a lot of because MAU often gives us an indicator. It's an early leading indicator of money that will come in over time. And it often correlates a little bit better to success than dollars that we earned this week, because dollars that we earned this week, people might charge you yearly or monthly, so MAU is often a much better indicator of how successful you're going to be. So we try and pick some sort of outcome that we want to focus on, a business value, and get the team to think about that. Now, OKRs is probably something that most people have heard about. OKRs are a very similar concept, but that's sort of, OKRs are like the mechanism that we use to enact outcome-driven development. And down to a certain level, I would say, in our company. So every team in our company of reasonable size, so let's say 15 people, will tend to have one or more OKRs that they are looking at and that they're driving for the year. And so OKRs, the O in OKRs means objective. And objective is really the English free text, easy to understand version of like, what are we trying to achieve? And the KR is the key result. So the KR is the thing that we're actually going to measure and say, we're trying to shift something from this level to this level. That's our actual goal. And the idea is here with this OKR that we use it to drive autonomy for the team. So in Atlassian, you obviously know that we're about teams, right? And so we believe that the power of the team is way bigger than the power of like individual executives or individual product managers or whatever. So getting the team engaged on something and really thinking through the problem, we just don't want individual developers to just sit there and be software developers who write code. Back when I was a developer, I feel like that's what I did. I just wrote code, and I think back onto what I was like and going, oh, I don't know why my manager put up with me, actually. But now as a manager, I really want product engineers, basically. I want to have people who are product engineers who are thinking about what are we trying to build, why are we building it, and so we try to use outcome-driven development and OKRs as a way of pushing that onto the team, saying, what is the problem? This is the problem we want you to solve. So some problems, it's easy to give them and say, solve this problem. Other problems are harder. Like, so if I say, look, we're having a problem with onboarding. We find that people are dropping out, so I want you to actually go and start measuring where people are dropping out and then start doing some experiments to increase the funnel, right? That's a fairly easy task to give to a developer, but it's a little bit outside the spectrum of like, just write this piece of software, take this Jira ticket, and write the software, write some tests, ship it. Like that's not what we want to do. We want to. There's a fantastic quote by an author called Marty Kagan. He wrote a book called Inspired, which is all about product management. And he basically says, I want my developers to be missionaries, not mercenaries. So like a mercenary developer is basically just going to take a Jira ticket, read it, go, yes, I'll do that. I've done that. I've written some tests. It's all good. I'll go home for the day and won't worry about anything else. But instead, we want people who are really thinking about the product and really bought into it. So this is an example of an OKR. This was the Bitbucket Pipelines OKR. Well, it was actually, it's not our OKR. It's our key result. It sort of implies what the objective is. But the key result was to increase the number of paid teams in Bitbucket that were using pipelines. So I've taken the actual details out of there because legal wouldn't let me leave them in. And so what we're doing there is we're trying to use this as the guiding light for our team and saying, this is the thing that we need to do this year. We need to ensure that that goes from this number to this number. And then we think, okay, well, how are we going to do that? So probably like most of your teams, we end up building a product roadmap. And in our product roadmap, it's basically a bunch of ideas that we've had that we think are going to do this, right? This is our goal. Our product roadmap is all about doing that. And so those ideas, the ones that are hopefully close on the roadmap, we've got a fairly good idea that they are actually going to do this. And so we've been putting some thought into it, and we're basically trying to let the product manager, the designer, and myself, maybe as an engineering manager, run ahead of the engineers and try and validate that these are feasible ideas. And so we build a hypothesis for each particular feature on our roadmap that's saying that they're going to impact this objective that we have. And the hypothesis is based on a number of things. It's based on a lot of subjective information, like customer interviews, so feedback that we get on community, open issue tickets that we have in our issue tracker, or feature requests that we have, the number of votes on those feature requests, just any other sort of quantitative or qualitative sentiment that we can try and gather that's going to validate our approach here. And we tend to then take those things and put them on the roadmap, and as they get clearer, we're trying to, closer and closer, we're trying to work together more tightly to firm down what they actually are. However, we sort of have this problem particularly in Bitbucket Pipelines, that our high-level OKR here is really, really high level. And some of the things that we do during the year, they doesn't have an immediate impact on that at all. Right? It's very hard to see that just because we put out a new feature, we recently did a really big release for our feature called Pipes, which is a way of using Docker containers to compartmentalize your build and integrate with our partners. And that had heaps of press around it, and yet it's very hard to see an immediate jump there. Like the adoption is very slow, particularly in a CI/CD tool. People tend to, like if your CI/CD is working, why would you go and change it? Unless you need to do some new capability or starting a new project, you not tend to use one of our new features. So a lot of our current users don't use features. Unlike in Jira, where a user might come in and see something immediately and start using it straight away, for us there's actually a very long lag time for adoption. So we then have a problem about how we pass down something that's going to be a driver for our team when we're working on a feature. So for a feature, we want to have its own success metric. It's not just going to be that it's going to bump this by a certain amount. That's what we want it to do, but we can't measure that really, because we're going to be working on multiple things over that time. It's impossible to attribute this amount of growth in that measurement to that particular thing that we did, which means that it's really hard to give something that the teams are going to have to get animated around. So instead, what we do is we have to choose proxies for what we're working on, rather than focusing on a high-level OKR. I mean, it's similar to the process of breaking an OKR down into smaller and smaller pieces. But what we're doing is we're looking at any particular feature that we're doing, and we're deciding what our proxy is going to be. So onboarding, I've already mentioned onboarding. That's an easy one. Generally, it can be like, well, we need to widen our funnel in different places. We need to capture more people right at the start, or we need to get the people, look where the funnel's narrowing really precipitously, and then say we need to broaden that. We need to get more people into the product and adopting the product. For Delighter type features, there's a number of metrics we can look at. We can look at the support contact rate, so the number of people who are contacting support. We track that together with the support team, and we can say, well, we need to lower that by a certain amount. And we look at what the big pain point is there, and that the solutions that the team will come up might be around smoothing some of those pain points out. There are other delighters that might not necessarily be to delight you, our users, but it might be to delight the engineering team. So we can say, well, how often are they getting paged in the middle of the night and having to wake up and go and deal with a problem? So bringing that number down is definitely something they're quite interested in working on. But generally, Bitbucket Pipelines is still quite a new product in many ways. Well, we're sort of a sub-product within Bitbucket, but it's quite new in many ways. We've been around for about 2.5 years, but there's still lots of things that people are asking us for. And so we still release a lot of new features or tweaks to features. And so the proxy that we use there tends to be adoption. So, and then it's like, well, how do we actually come up with a metric for adoption? It can be quite tricky because different features get used for different things, but we tend to look at previous features that we've released and say, well, what sort of adoption did they achieve? Are they a similar feature? Did they have a similar number of votes? Were there a similar number of customers expressing interest in that? And then we'll set a target with that. Now, adoption isn't always the best metric. I think an example of a better metric might be recently we had a feature where we allowed people have multi-stage builds. And if the build fails, then when we first released pipelines, the only thing you could do was rerun the pipeline. So it would start the whole pipeline over again and do everything from the start. Then we had a feature where we said, well, if you're at the 5th step of a 6-step build and that fails and you've got a flaky build, then it might fail on the 3rd step next time and you'll just keep restarting again and again. So we introduced a new feature so that you could just rerun the last failed step. And then the metric we looked at then was we said, well, we want when people come in and look at a pipeline that has failed, if it has the ability to rerun the final step, i.e. it has more than 2 steps, we will say that we want some sort of percentage of people to be using the rerun step feature instead of the rerun pipeline feature. And so that was the metric we were looking at then. And this, I guess a metric like that really helps the engineering team to think, well, we can't just hide this feature away somewhere. It's got to be visible. We've got to think about the use cases, about when we should show it or when we should highlight it. And then make sure it's going to work for people, basically. So, but it does beg the question. So if we are not measuring the direct impact of the features that we're releasing on our high-level OKR, like what is the point? And there's 2 reasons for it. One is just to keep the team focused, right? So if we just said to the team, this is the objective that you have, but I think you should go and do it that way, I think you should go and add this step rerun feature, they might sort of get discouraged after a while and go like, why are we doing this? Like, why don't we work on that other feature that's my pet hobby project that I've been trying to get pushed for the last 2 years for us to work on? So this is saying, no, this is the thing you're working on. We've tried to get everybody together to come up with that metric. So there's actually something I forgot to mention. Is there anyone familiar with the Atlassian playbook? Yeah, a few hands. So Atlassian has a whole bunch of what we call playbooks, team playbooks, and like sporting analogy, it's like how to run plays to do different things. So there's different playbooks for running project kickoffs and doing marketing stuff. And there is one particular playbook that is called the goals and metrics play. And it's where it actually runs you through how to get your whole team together and get them to decide on what the metrics should be. So we typically have the product manager give some guidance in this area and show, like I spoke about, show like what the previous features were and what sort of what sort of adoption they achieved, and then get the team to buy in and say, well, is that the right thing? Can we come up with a better metric? And this is actually something we've only just started doing really recently. Not all teams at Atlassian use all the playbooks, which might shock you to know, but we've started using that and found that that's much better for getting the team engaged. That we went through a period where the team was saying, oh, what's the point in having these metrics? And they were, even though we were trying to say, well, this is the point here, they'd still get defocused. And so we find that by actually getting the team to set what the metrics are, they're way more engaged with those metrics. So part of it is trying to keep them focused on what problem we're trying to solve here, and part of it is like making sure they understand why we think that this particular feature is going to be something that adds value to our customer. But we can often measure like why we think it's valuable, because adoption of individual features actually is a good measure over time to say whether a feature is particularly healthy. If people use it over time, that's a very good sign. So we are using these measures for multiple reasons. One is over the long time, but to make sure that it is valuable, and one is over the short time. So again, with that constant iteration that we want to be having, the frequent iteration of putting something out in front of customers and getting feedback. And there are two types of feedback you get there, obviously, qualitative and quantitative. But you're not going to get any of that quantitative feedback if you don't have a measure that you can look at. Like, especially if you're dealing with a small subset of your users, like being able to look at our high-level OKR, it would just be a drop in the ocean. We wouldn't see anything. Whereas here, with our recent Pipes release, we were able to see immediately, once we put the Pipes feature out to a small subset of our users, whether any of them were adopting it, whether they were seeing it, whether they were clicking on things to see what that feature was about and get immediate feedback really quickly. So the measures that we're doing are definitely giving us feedback. And I'll show you how we use some of those metrics later on. So part of getting that early feedback is the way that we interact with our customers and our customer base. We're really lucky that we've got a group of users who have signed up to be alpha users. And so our alpha group, this is another strategy you can use in your products if possible, to get people to adopt things that are not really ready for the wider audience yet. So these people are quite happy for us to put things in front of them. Because we're a build tool, they don't really opt into it unless they start using it. But we'll put features in front of them and say, hey, here's a new feature that we're working on, and we get feedback immediately. And this actually works really, really well. They get direct email from us saying that something has gone out, and there's specific pages on our Confluence website with the documentation for that particular feature that they can look at and start to use it. And they can give us direct email feedback about that as well. So we recently had a feature called the Power Builds feature, which is where if you have code and it's in a pull request, we have a specific build that you can specify in your pipeline's YAML file and say, run this build when there's an open pull request. So this is partly I guess this feature was partly so that people wouldn't run builds when they didn't have a pull request. So if there were early commits on a feature branch, that we didn't unnecessarily waste build time. But the other one was if they had a specific process they wanted to go through for a pull request. So we released this out to our alpha group, and we were immediately getting feedback from them saying, oh, this isn't what we wanted. We were really excited when we saw this. We didn't want this. We want the target branch merged into the source branch so we can actually see the build result running on what the end of the result of the merge would be. So to us, this was like, for some reason that never occurred to us that that's what people want. Or if we thought, oh yeah, some people might want that, but they can do that manually themselves. Whereas the overwhelming feedback was that everybody expected it to work like this. So we were able to really quickly change direction very late in the cycle of when this was going to go out. Another thing that we did was we actually held back a release with the pipes release, we held it back for extra time to make sure we're getting more feedback from our users. So we actually put it out not just to the alpha group, but to a group of about 20% of our users. And then they continued to give us feedback, and they started using the pipes. And so we had two things. We were asking for what pipes are missing and would you like to see, was one of the things we were getting. That was really meaningful feedback for us to try and figure out what we should go and work on and add before we did a big marketing release. One of the other pieces of feedback, there was just what pipes were people using. And so we could then go and iterate on those pipes and polish them better and make sure the documentation was really good and stuff like that. So that iterating really helped us when we went out to everybody to have a really good release. So I guess the question is, when do we check the metrics? So I mean, I've been saying all along, we want to do this iterative release of putting something out and validating it and getting feedback. And so we are trying to check these as often as possible. Now, there is the odd feature that this approach doesn't necessarily work. Sometimes, despite what we do, the adoption rate is so slow that it's really hard to get an indication of whether this is going to be successful in the end or not. So sometimes, ideally, for a good feature, yep, we're checking it all the time. We're checking it daily to see what's happening with the features that we released yesterday. But sometimes we're only checking it weekly. And this will be the project lead or the project manager will be looking at it and trying to get that feedback for when they're figuring out what stories to put into the next sprint. What are we going to iterate on? Otherwise, we have a longer cycle for it. But we're also looking at all the features that we're working on at any one particular time. And weekly, we have what we call a leads meeting, which tends to be the team leads and the engineering managers, the tech writer, the designer, the product managers. And we all sit down and we'll look at the recent features that we're working on and shipping, and we'll look at the metrics that are coming back from those. We tend to try and have one key metric being the success criteria for something that we're working on, but we'll tend to build a whole dashboard of all the metrics we can get about anything that we're working on so that we can look for any sort of information that we can sift out of that that's going to be valuable feedback for us. And in the longer term, that leadership group actually takes all the features. So we will take the adoption metric, which I said is not super good for motivating a team, but it's actually super good for looking at how healthy the individual components of your product are. So this is our dashboard with all of the interesting, useful, and meaningful information grayed out so that you can't see it, and so that legal doesn't get me in trouble. But these are all different features within Bitbucket pipelines. And what we're measuring here is the absolute number of repositories that are using something, and the red lines there are typically the overall percentage of it's either accounts or repositories, depending on the particular feature, that are using that feature. And so you can see that this one here looks great. The ones on the right, they look fantastic. I think the one on the top right is probably our pipes feature, which we only released recently, that started taking off. I did take this screenshot a little while ago. I think the one underneath it is probably the caching feature. The caching feature is really popular in that everybody uses that in order to speed up their builds, and so it's quite heavily used. But we're tracking a number of different things there. I think this one on the left may actually be the step rerun feature, and so we were then tracking like how many people are clicking, as I said before, like how many people actually use step rerun, and we actually found that to be really successful. It was like over 70% of people who would come to a failed build would click on the step rerun rather than the whole pipeline rerun, which was way above our success criteria, which is good. So this forces us to go through as a group, and we assign one person in the group as an owner for each of these metrics. We've got probably about 30 of these, and each person is an owner for one of these metrics and basically gives it sort of a health check, a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a wavy hand type thing to say, oh, I'm not sure about this. Some features actually decline, so we released a feature to automatically enable builds to push code back to their repository that they came from. But previous to that, you had to go and get an SSH key for a particular user in Bitbucket and add it into your repository settings for pipelines, and the SSH key would be copied into the build for you, and people would do that. It was much more elaborate and complicated. But we started to see a decline in SSH keys, which we actually took as a measure of success that the pushing back feature was working for us. So there's various reasons why things go up and down. Sometimes features will reach a natural plateau of adoption, and then you're just looking to make sure that they stay on that plateau, or you can explain any reasons why they're going down. So we actually find this really useful for talking about how healthy things are And when we take this to execs, they love the fact that our team is driven by these sorts of metrics, and we've got dashboards for this sort of thing, so we can go and look at stuff. We actually also use these dashboards for our financial health, where the money that's coming in, how much we're spending on hardware and equipment in AWS, all sorts of things. They're really, really useful. So measuring is really important. I think the challenge is about setting good metrics. That is still a challenge, and that's something, it's almost like estimating. It's something that you have to practice and work on to get better at. It's very difficult, but measuring all the things, if you're not measuring them, you can't have a goal. Giving your team a goal so that they have something that's not just go and implement this feature, which they may or may not agree with, but I think giving them that goal to motivate them and giving them the autonomy to work on the solution in the way that they think, and getting all the brains engaged with coming up with a really good solution. Shipping code, getting that feedback as quickly as you can. And the two different approaches that we have of using the metrics to get the quantitative feedback, but then also getting the qualitative feedback from our alpha group is really, really good and really helps us decide if we need to change course. So that's just one of the tips that I could give you about how we try to build the right thing. The other thing we need to do is we need to ship stuff quickly. If we can't get that out there and get that feedback quickly, that whole approach that I just talked about is going to be fairly meaningless. Like, we need to get that stuff out to alpha group. We sometimes are iterating stuff while it's with the alpha group so that they can see the changes over time. And to do that, we need to be able to get our code out there really quickly. Now, given that Bitbucket Pipelines is a CI/CD tool, I could talk for ages about this, but I won't. There are two talks that are happening tomorrow about CI/CD. One's from Matt Shelton, is a technical account manager, so his talk is a bit across Bamboo and Bitbucket Pipelines, whereas I think that Srinath is not an Atlassian, so he's from an external company, and he's talking tomorrow, and he definitely is using Bitbucket Pipelines. So these are two good talks to go to if you're really interested in learning more about CI/CD and how to speed up your development processes and make that more effective. So, building the right thing, shipping fast, but dealing with the complexity of trying to ship 33 times a week and all the dependencies, and what are some of the approaches that we can take for dealing with that. I've sort of got two things to talk about here. One's really brief, but I'll start with the bigger one. Basically, my solution is to do more stuff. You've only got so many people though, so how do you do more stuff? So part of this is really making sure that we have enough work for everybody to do all the time, and that we're giving enough time for the product manager and the designer to go off and validate what the customer problem is and what our approach is going to be to solving that problem. So we want to do more things. So we run multiple projects at any one time. In Bitbucket Pipelines, we only have 2 teams and of 6 people each. But each of those teams is working on 3 different projects at the same time. So they typically have one really large user-facing feature, and then they'll have 2 smaller features, one of which might be, you might have heard of GDPR. We have GDPR work to do. We might have a technical health problem or an operations problem about people getting woken up in the night that we're working on. Or it might just be a smaller user feature, something that people have worked on in 20% time and we think is really valuable and we want to ship. So what this gives us is a lot of concurrency going on. Now, managing that concurrency can be really difficult. Does this not just put a bigger load on the product manager? So what we're trying to do is offload the load from the product manager onto individual members of the team. You can remember that I talked about missionaries, not mercenaries. So what we do is we have a thing called a feature lead. So a feature lead is very similar to a tech lead. I think the name change is really significant, right? This is not the engineer who's going to figure out how we are going to engineer the solution to the problem. This is the engineer who is basically going to think about all the factors of the feature. And I'll go over that as we go. This is a leveling up of what the engineers usually do, right? They're starting to think about whole features. They get to interact with a whole different bunch of people. This is really good for their careers. This is really good for thinking about project management, how to break stories down. There's a whole bunch of things that they have to do in here that really helps them. And it does keep coming back to that missionaries, not mercenaries thing that I love. It's a chance for the software engineers to grow into product engineers. So who's familiar with the concept of triads? I don't know if this is just something we use in Atlassian or it's a wider thing. So a triad is basically someone from engineering, a product manager, and a designer. And this is typically the, if I can get this right, those three people are concerned with the usability of a feature, the viability of a feature, and the feasibility of a feature. So they are the three people that represent those pillars. So in this context, the feature lead acts as the engineering part of that pillar. So that's not me, the engineering manager, because I'm not that familiar with the code. In particular, for me, I've moved around different teams, and so I don't think I've hardly written any code inside of pipelines at all. Most of my code is in other products in Atlassian. So having me being the representative for engineering here is not very good. And the team leads as well, like the team leads could probably do this, but what is the point of having a team lead do this when you can give it to an engineer instead and let them experience that and level their skills up and work in a bigger area? And let them focus on actually managing people instead of building things, which is another little thing that I like. So this is what a triad looks like. So there are multiple other triads though as well. We have what's called a run triad. So this is, the run triad might engage with support or operations here. And so this would normally be the product management and the engineer who are working with the support people, the ops people. So the feature lead is also involved in that triad. So they become part of that, and then they're talking to the support people and letting them know what features that are coming up, how they might be impacted in support, what sort of questions might come up with support, or talking to the ops people and saying what things might go wrong there. But basically what they're doing is they're doing this instead of the product manager. We really want that product manager to be freed up to be working on one of the other 5 projects that we've got going on, or to be thinking about the strategy and the tactics that we're going to have in the short term and the long term, and how our product is going to win. That's what I want our product manager to be thinking about, not to be dealing with operations and support people. Of course, there's another triad, which is commonly called the sell triad, which typically is the designer and the product manager and the marketers. And again here, we don't want the product manager engaged as much as possible, so we get the feature lead to relieve them of those duties as well. So nowhere here do they totally relieve the product manager. This is totally, it depends on the expertise of the engineer who's involved about how good they're going to be at this, and how well they're going to go in doing this role. So the product manager is always there to back them up. But when they're back in this original triad there, what we're just trying to do is build enough knowledge of what we're going to build to get just enough going so that we can then kick it over the fence and hand it off to the engineers. So from there we have a feature kickoff, which is another play that Atlassian has. And in this play, we're just taking that feature and we're saying, let's get the engineers together and start to get them involved and get them to ask a whole bunch of questions about the spec. I think I need to really speed up. Sorry, I've gone a bit long. So the feature kickoff is where the feature lead really then gets all the team engaged and gets them to start thinking about things. They then have to take that feature, break it down into stories, which we break up into, I'm going to deliver this to our alpha team, our alpha group, or it's going to be something that's going to go out when we go live, or it might be something that we don't build at all. So they're also getting that experience of working with project management and breaking things down. They're the coordinator. They're setting the project status, and they're also checking the metrics. So coming back to the metrics, they're the person that is feeding that metrics back into the team and making sure that they're getting the feedback from them to guide the team in the right direction. So they are taking the load off the PM, they're enabling multiple streams, and it's leveling up the engineers. The other thing we do is we decouple marketing from shipping. So we say marketing can happen sometime after we've shipped. All right, so I'm really going to go quickly recap through all that. I had to skip through that last bit very quickly there because I wasn't keeping an eye on the clock. We try to be metric driven. We try to make sure that we're focusing on customer value, and we try to make sure that all of our engineers are PMs. This relieves the PM of a lot of stuff. It lets us release small and often and get the feedback we need in order to move fast and make sure we're building the right thing. And we then try and keep those adaptive teams going that are going to we lean on that feature lead to be that nexus of communication to make sure that everybody is being kept in the loop. And here are some links to some of the things I mentioned. Product triads at the top there, the goals, signals, and measures play, and the feature kickoff play. You can just Google for these on the Atlassian website, or you can take a photo of them. The Inspired book by Maina Kagan is really good. Radical Focus and Measure What Matters are also talking about OKRs, which is something that we use internally a lot of. You can probably find some of those links really helpful. There's also a thing there called Project Central. That's something we use internally for project tracking that's also very helpful, where we centralize all the information about particular projects feature leads are working on. All right, I'm totally out of time, overtime. Thank you very much.